Hari Om, Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. The introductions are always flattering. It's downhill from there. The promise is that we'll try and not make it that. I plead not guilty to the charge of scholar, an interesting speaker, or thinker. I come here as somebody who's concerned about my own child because I care deeply about the moral conviction that she will grow up with. I care very deeply about how she thinks about her own society. I care very deeply about the relationships that she is able to build with her own friends. And I care very deeply about what kind of wisdom, cultural knowledge we are able to pass on. So the work that I do and my team does at Bṛhat is essentially about building institutions for cultural transference. Obviously, when you had a different socio-economic structure, these things were natural. They were organic. But as the socio-economic structure broke down, or we had developments ranging from historical to industrial, we're, I think, yet to find the right vehicles for transmitting our values and our culture to our own children. And I look at the entire work of IKS from the perspective of that young person who needs a moral and intellectual conviction about the place that she's born in, about the people that she's growing up with, and about the inheritance that she has. And that's my work. And we spoke about civilizational knowledge systems. We spoke about the worldview. The challenge today is that we are moving, if we were to draw from some of the work that CES has also done, and I think this was alluded to briefly in the morning session, the VC sir spoke about this. The challenge is that we are moving from an experiential tradition, which is what we are as Bṛhat, which we saw so beautifully represented in the session on Itihasa Purana as pedagogy, as performative elements in our pedagogical standards. We are moving from the experiential traditions to the analytical traditions, to the explanatory traditions. So how do we navigate this complexity? When we think about knowledge systems, we are also thinking about the sum total of the truth claim that we have. We are thinking about the means of validation. We are thinking about the idea of values in research. What is the axiology? We're also thinking about the praxis. What is the actual practiced method that we call, and what constitutes Indian knowledge systems? So I wish to share with you, because we are now, I think, entering a sophisticated phase of the Indian knowledge systems discourse. If you look at any cultural phenomenon, they go through certain phases. There are many interesting works on this. I look at this as three phases. First phase is the naive phase. In the naive phase, a few of us are coming up with a certain idea. You're trying to galvanize some imagination around it. You're trying to convince yourself more than the other that this is something worth dedicating your life towards. But once that happens, once that conviction comes from the individual and it is able to convince somebody else, you then see that it gradually ascends, it gains a momentum, and it moves into what we call the sophisticated phase. And in a sophisticated phase, you see large number of people wanting to take part in that discourse. And I would actually stake a claim that Indian knowledge systems is now entering a very sophisticated phase. You would see a very active interest from people across the different streams. We're talking about a multidisciplinary mind. We're talking about multidisciplinary education. None of that is going to be possible unless you have multidisciplinary people coming into this paradigm. I think we are entering that paradigm right now. There is a danger, and I think Mahadevanji has spoken about this in multiple occasions, that when you are reaching that phase of sophistication, you can either go ahead and make that an epoch, you can make that a paradigm, or you run the risk of actually making it decadent. And the hubris is what leads that to the downward slope. And we've gotten that caution this morning as well. And Anil Sahasrabudheji had mentioned that as you think about this strategy, also think about the dangers lurking just behind the minds that are working on this. So I hope to provide some perspective today about the strategies. I'm immensely grateful that Chanakya University has taken it upon himself to be a pioneer, to be a complexity navigator for Indian knowledge systems and get all of us here together. We heard this morning about how difficult it was to actually conceptualize something like this, what kind of time, effort, energy, and leadership it takes to execute something like this. It's not easy because it's not the prevailing paradigm. So I'm very grateful, firstly, that Chanakya University has taken it upon itself to run this. And I'm also very grateful to have an opportunity to provide my perspective as somebody who's working in the Indian knowledge system area as an outsider in. I try and compound the work that's happening at the universities, that's happening at the IKS Center, that's happening in the cultural sphere. And I have certain thoughts about how this movement, this entire intellectual arena is going to be shaped. And I hope to share that with you and provoke a conversation around that. Firstly, I'm very happy that the framing of this conference itself is future forming. There is, in fact, a very, very pivotal research paper, some of you might be familiar with it, that research should not be about mirroring. Research, the purpose of research is not just to say what it is actually future forming. There has to be a future activity coming out of research. And I like the framing that we've used for this conference here: issues, strategies, and way forward. And I think that's the right way to think about it. We have to meditate on where we are, what are the pitfalls, what are the potentialities. We also have to think about strategy. Any strategy, and we have a professor of strategy sitting here with us. At the risk of sounding a little immodest, I will just mention my understanding of strategy is that you have to think about the resources that you have to think about the destination that you want to reach, and you need to know what is the pathway, right? And this is the job that we have. I think that is the goal this conference is setting for all of us, that you need to really be sincere about the issues that you find in IKS. You also have to meditate about how do we galvanize the resources that we can cumulatively put together: the energy resource, the mental resource, the intellectual resource, the philosophical resource, and of course the entire inheritance of the civilizational knowledge system that we have. But then all of this also has to yield a roadmap. We need to leave this conference, and I think that's the definition of success for this, with a fairly substantial idea of how the next 10, 15 years is going to look like. And once we establish that in our mind's eye, that is the truth that will then guide the action. So my interest here today is to leave us with certain ideas, leave us with certain vision about how this thing called IKS is likely to pan out in the next decade or so. So with that, I want to just make a bold provocation. Because whenever you talk about a strategy, it begins with a certain credo, it begins with a certain vision. If we can all visualize, and this is a goal that we've given ourselves, it seems immodest for a small organization of not more than 8 months old to be talking about this, and I'm perfectly aware of that. But I would still go ahead and say this. If we can imagine in our mind's eye that within the next 15 years, no child in India should leave the education system without being acquainted with certain core civilizational texts. That is what Indian knowledge system really is. I have chosen 4 based on my understanding. I don't have any claim of this being exhaustive, but I think of this as the intelligences that a kid needs to develop in dealing with the complexity that we are leaving for them. And they need to have the aesthetic intelligence to actually understand how the world reacts to a certain aesthetic. That's why we need to introduce them to Nati Shastra. They need to develop logical intelligence. There are going to be many, many battles of narratives. There is a whole war out there for identity, and that is the strategy that powers be, who would like to see India the way it is muddling along, have. And the one dimension that we need to develop is the ability to cognitively decipher the narratives and actually retain and recognize our identity. So an introduction to Tarka, to Nyaya is very critical in my view. We also need to understand the psychological dimensions, the rich tradition of Indian psychology. And I would say, if you were to look at a certain stage of development in terms of curriculum, resources, courses, learning outcomes, and also linked to the industry and potential outcomes for society, Indian psychology is uniquely positioned. There is, I don't think, any question in our minds that it has the resources that can actually shape the next wave of psychology. So Yoga Sutras and understanding our own mind, body, energy complex as part of education, not something that happens in an ancillary manner, but something that happens by design as part of our education is, I think, the next critical step. And we also think about linguistics, language intelligence. There might be many texts, there are many experts here, but I'm just making a proposition that we need to think about how that is embedded into the primary education itself. There are only few things that you can do at the top level. Although my proximity is towards higher education, more related and limited to public policy thinking, I recognize that you can only work with so much at the topsoil level. You need to curate this. Vidya Kshetra is not too far from here. Munit Dimanji has been doing this work for years very close to Bangalore. Entire Panchakosha based pedagogy. we need to take that bold step and say, we have the pedagogy for child development. And I would say that we need to think about this. But combined with this, because there is a lot of social complexity we have actually left, like I said, for our children, we need to make sure that they have their own modes of storytelling. They have their own modes of meaning making. And to me, when we think about Puranas as pedagogy, the session that we had this morning about Abhinaya, about the different kinds of art forms that form the very core of civilizational integrity, that has to be the sociological base for Indian education. So within the next 15 years, if we can move from the political discourse to a knowledge-based discourse, where we leave our children with an acquaintance and a very deep engagement with the civilizational texts, I think that is the vision for IKS. That is the definition of success for the work and for the gathering that we have. I think when we start with paradigm, when we start using certain paraphernalia, we call it IKS. These are all strategic inroads. This is a vocabulary that we've introduced, but it is important to understand and have a fairly clear idea about how a conceptual idea or a concept turns into a public movement. How does it actually capture the imagination? The first important thing is defining the vocabulary. And I've just drafted this based on the textbook that Mahadevanji and others have written about conceptualizing IKS and clarifying the vocabulary. What do we mean by IKS? All of us need to have a certain fairly well agreed upon definition. So you have the core of Sanatana Dharma, the Chaturdasa Vidyasthana. You have the the scientific, the agricultural, the engineering, the wellness, the public administration, the economic dimensions of our learning as well. You think about the other dharmic faiths which have also contributed to this knowledge pool that we have. You think about the wealth of regional literature, regional knowledge systems, folk, tribal knowledge systems that we have. And then you think about the non-literary forms as well, the art forms, the folklore, the oral traditions, just the lived practice that is Bṛhat. And all of those things together, put together, is what we call the Indian knowledge system. I'd like to make a proposition based on the book that we visualize these things and we have a certain acceptable and accepted vocabulary to engage in. The first thing in any movement is to clarify the vocabulary. Once that happens, you would have certain people who are then picking it up, and you will have a few hero movements in any movement, right? You will have certain people writing a book, composing a poem, coming up with a new education model, and those need to be celebrated. That is the feedback loop that we need to create. We cannot be playing a small micro game here. We need to think about compounding by truly celebrating each other's success and understanding that the end goal is actually a sum total of all the things that we're doing together. So the idea here is that you have the vocabulary, we organize ourselves around it. You have certain entrepreneurial efforts within the university, outside the university, in the industry, and all of those things come together to give us a certain conviction that this is now an established practice. When that happens, you then see that there is a mimicking. People would like to join and mimic that process. That is human nature. The entire desire cultivation happens when you create something that people want to imitate. And the more people imitate this, you will see that this movement is expanding. Eventually, that will turn into a story. And that story is the map of meaning that people will carry. In the next 15 years, if we are able to cognitively rewire our entire society and give new maps of meaning, which are based on our metaphors, our allegories, our thinking modes, our languages, that is the sum total of what we are calling the Indian knowledge system paradigm. Now, moving from vocabulary to thinking about IKS episteme as a system. When you think about anything as a system, you generally think about it in three parts. One is the constituent elements themselves. What are the organizing parts? In a body, obviously, you have certain parts, and any system that you take has certain elements. Right? I'd like to propose that we think of IKS in three constructs: the Dharma, the Driṣtī, and the Diśā. And I'll try and explain what I mean by each of these. But those are the constituent parts or the basic building blocks of IKS as I see it. Right? Then, of course, you will have to think about the feedback loops and the way energy channelizes through this system. What is the information flow? Who are the people who are providing this information? Who is consuming this information? And how is it creating a surplus energy by going through that system? And that is where you have faculty, you will have curriculum, you will have learning experience design. You will have narratives of education as a portal for global well-being. The vision has to be expansive. The vision has to be inclusive. Right? That is the energy system that we need to create within IKS. But the biggest lever and the greatest leverage point you will have in any system is the purpose. It is, you can tinker a few on the constituent parts, you can tweak, in the information flow, you will get a little bit more impact. But if you have to really leverage the deepest strength you have, it is about fixing the goal. The goal that we have is, you can call it Atmanirbharta, you can call it reversing the gaze, you can call it changing the Driṣtī. It is about heralding the Indic Episteme. And I think this was spoken about in the morning session. If I were to just glean all the things that we heard this morning, it is that IKS is not just content. IKS is not a subject. IKS is not a course. IKS is not an FDP. IKS is not just a career. IKS is a fundamental way of looking at the world and knowledge that alters your behavior. That is true knowledge. And to me, that is the purpose and that is the praxis of IKS. That it is something that you cannot remain unaffected in your own behavior once you come into contact with Indian knowledge systems. That is the conviction that I have just based on my anubhuti, and that's what I would like to make a case for. Right? So when we think about Dharma, so just breaking it down from Dharma, Driṣtī and Diśā, the first aspect of Dharma, I think about this in three dimensions or three orders of consequences, if you will. At the first level, we have to start with the individual. We're going through a time now where the very basis of meaning making, of making sense of our world, making sense of our life itself, is increasingly being contested. IKS has to go out and stand up to the theories that are coming up in academia. Rajiv Malhotra ji was in Hyderabad a couple of days ago. We were hosting him from our organization. He spoke about his new work, The Battleground for IITs, about how certain sociological theories from the West have now been internalized as theories of education within the Indian academia, particularly the top institutions. This is a moment of grave crisis because this is going to lead to violence. This is going to lead to a generation of people who are confused about what is to be done with their own lives. And this is not a trivial matter. So fundamentally, if you have to make a case, an intellectual and a moral case, the dharma of IKS is that in the Purushartha framework, in the Pancharana framework, in the way it helps you understand your own link between the society, the cosmos, your own self, it gives you a terrain map to navigate through your own life. It helps you realize that you are mortal, that you will age, you will have certain responsibilities, there will be certain successes and a lot of failures. It helps you hold your ground in your own life. And I think that is, when we talk about loneliness as an epidemic, when we're talking about divorce rates increasing, education essentially is about how we build a coherent society. And that starts with the individual. And I think that is the moral and intellectual case at the individual level, that it is the founding basis or a foundation for you to be able to navigate through a complex world. But at the second level, it also has to give you social coherence. And this has been the Bharatiya way always, that the interaction between the individual and the next unit, a family, a kula, a jati, is always symbiotic. It is something that is able to give that feedback that my actions matter to you and you respect my actions. So my identity, my belonging, my pride is reinforced by your belief. And that is also when we think about IKS as a paradigm in education. I imagine, in the next 5 years, 1 lakh yoga teachers in educational institutions having real work to do. I imagine Ayurveda professors. I imagine Yoga Sutra scholars. I imagine all the acharyas of our Chaturdasa Vidyasthana coming into universities and talking about and teaching and interacting with students. And when that happens, the knowledge that they carry in their own language, in their own structure, in their own local index becomes valuable and respected by the society. That drives social coherence. That is the next level of fractal that we're thinking about. But there is, I think, a larger case here that IKS has to strategize and start communicating. That we have to conceptualize Indian knowledge systems not just as a means of instruction in a university or a school. IKS is fundamentally the route on which national integrity is going to be secured. When we talk about battlefields moving from the external to the minds of people, There is a fifth column. There are those of us who are in the public square who are grappling with narratives every day. We understand that there are many interests who would like to present India as just an agglomeration. There is no cohesion about Bharat. And I would say that to counter that is not possible without actually having a grounding in IKS. My biggest sort of strategic framing for IKS, persuasion, if you will, is that we have to think about Indian knowledge systems as the very means for civilizational integrity. So I think about this IKS at these three levels, and that I think is the Dharma of IKS. So that is the Dharma. Then what is the Driṣtī? Right? I'm not claiming scholarly expertise here when I talk about Panchakosha, but I think about the society organized in terms of its discourse across 5 dimensions. And I think it's very important that we start framing certain public narratives about IKS. To me, firstly, IKS is justice. IKS is Antyodaya. So far, we've only conceptualized Antyodaya as a role of state where it dispenses material benefits to the last person standing. It's a highly important cause. Dignity in accessing public service is the very basis for society. But for the next level, for the nation, the civilization to become truly Atmanirbhar, we have to reframe that and we have to reorient and rethink the role of the state itself. State is not a dispenser of benefits from the top alone, although that is needed sometimes. It is essentially an enabler of the potential that is inherent in us. And we will have to think about justice as actually helping every single person realize their potential. That to me is the reframing of Antyodaya that we need to think of as IKS. Complexity thinking, I've spoken about this a couple of times. Think about COVID. The monochromatic narrative and the global policy making that all of us have been subjected to in COVID, and the after effects of that are now, unfortunately, not so much discourse in India, but if you follow the discourse in US, in UK, there is now a lot of churn around the policy making for COVID. And there is substantial consensus that it has led us to more damage than it has saved. And that is because there was a lack of epistemic diversity. There was a lack of models of complexity thinking. And once you root yourself in Indian knowledge systems, we fondly talk about mathematics and poetry. We talk about art forms and storytelling as sociology. This is a non-trivial matter. This is actually the very core of diversity that can actually lead to a better way of global dealing with complexity. We think of IKS as sustainability. There was a mention of SDG. All of us know that the Dharma-centered thinking is essentially about maintaining the system equilibrium. It is about sustainability. This public narrative has to be built. Whatever we are thinking, conceptualizing as IKS has to actually start having public currency in problems that the society is facing. Collectively, whether it is at a national level or at a global level. And finally, when we think about the vision that the nation has been given, we are talking about Amrit Kal, time is our friend in the next 25 years. I genuinely think, and I believe this is the force that gives me the conviction to act, that within the next 25 years, India is going to be the net knowledge provider to the world. And that is what we mean by Atmanirbharta. That we are sufficiently located within ourselves, but we are also able to expand to others. And that will only come from a core knowledge system. So I think of certain public narratives that we need to advance from universities, from media, from industry, from storytellers, from influencers, from the world of arts, that we need to think of IKS in certain ways. And I would say that you need to go from the Annamaya Kosha at the exterior economic layer, all the way to the Pranamaya as political, the Manomaya as cultural, the Vijnanamaya as the philosophical core, and finally to that self-centered, self-realized, self-aware core that we're talking about as the vision for education. So if we do that, if we agree that this is a way to think about Dharma and Driṣtī of IKS, what is the Diśā? What can we really do? Because there's been enough talk. What is the action roadmap? I would say we need to think about 5 stakeholders in this, and we need to have an engagement strategy for each of them. We need to find the compounding elements between the 5. First, at the top layer, and this is true, at least in my understanding, when you think about any public policy, you need a certain policy thinking. You need political air cover. you need to have the state supporting certain modes of thinking, which is what is enacted as public policy. And in public policy, we now see with the new education policy, we are able to talk about Indian knowledge systems, maybe not as substantially, not as affirmatively as we would like, but we have enough and more leeway there to creatively work together and give that feedback to the policymaker that what you're doing is something important, to make sure that their own actions at the political level, because they're dealing with far more complexity than you and I are, and we need to empathize with that. We need to give that feedback that we are with you because we agree with this framing. And that then gets into the next version of NEP, that gets into the execution roadmap for NEP, that gets into the fund allocation for IKS-based teachers. This is a policy dialogue that some of our interlocutors need to have with policymakers. And people, leaders who lead or who have public responsibilities, they thrive on that public feedback. They need that public feedback. So I would say the first layer, we need to think about the policy making and how universities and all the other constituent parts of Indian knowledge systems is having that dialogue with policy making. At the second level, and I alluded to this as a fantastic example at Chanakya University itself, is the academic leadership. We need certain leaders in academia to take that first bold step, to say that this is our paradigm, this is our episteme, to say that we are going to have certain electives, to say that we are going to sponsor some faculty development programs, to talk to the parents and say this is actually something that will be helpful in the making of your child. So I think the next order is for us to have and expand this dialogue within the academic leadership community about how IKS is going to be located within academia. The third, very, very critical is to make sure that there are jobs at the end of the day. You need to think about the entire reverse integration, just the way Reliance would do a reverse integration from dyes to petrol. You need to think about what are the other elements for this to be a success. Why should that young person think about IKS? What reason have we given her? It is important because we are asking her to make a choice about her life. And we need to make sure that there is an opportunity that actually realizes her potential at the end of the day. And that means that industry has to be engaged. Industry leaders have to be told that this is better quality human capital for you. And in a world where fractured identities, when we talk about bringing the whole self to the office, when we talk about bring yourself, be yourself at workplace, substantially today that whole self is political. How are you going to deal with this in the industry in 10 years from now, when the entire narrative is about political beliefs, your belief versus my belief? We're saying that IKS is something that assures your identity, and therefore there is better human potential to be engaged in productive economic and business and commercial activities that can generate the artha for the nation. You need to then also have a mission for engaging with parents. I would love to see a joint, combined effort from multiple universities who are talking to parents about the challenges that we are facing. It's time we have an honest dialogue about the rut that we are in education. We cannot paint or gloss over this anymore. We need to make sure that we are able to tell them that the next decade is going to be one of economic tumult. It is going to be one potentially that will have a global cascade. And we need to come together and say, if we want our children to actually navigate through that world, we need to rethink what we are offering as education and the partnership that academic leaders and parents have. I would say that is probably the critical cog, because decision making about education is still largely with parents, and it should be, because they are critical stakeholders. And lastly, at the center of all of this is the learner. And unless we are able to translate whatever we are thinking here outside of academia, if you're going to be having just an academic dialogue and be happy about the papers that we present, it is not going to convince the people outside about the worth of IKS. It is the learner at the center of this design. This means it's a design competency. It is a communication competency. It has to be grounded in empathy. And we have to convince them that we are empathetic about their situation. So I would say 5 stakeholder engagement strategies that we need, from policy making to academic leadership, to working with the industry, to working with parents, and finally with learners. Each of us needs to be thinking about this. Now, if we agree that this could be a way, then what can we think about as potential roadmap? This is notional, right? I mean, there is no science, and you don't need science in this, to be honest. You need imagination, and sometimes imagination is much, much bigger. Think about how many people we can get through to IKS. There's a lot of things that we're doing. I ran Bṛhat Educational Trust and Bṛhat Cultural Storytelling. I think of this entire movement as a symphony between the cultural storytelling which generates the awareness. Somebody spoke this morning about the challenges that our people do not have the way to access our culture. We haven't told them what this festival stands for. We haven't told them what this yatra means. We haven't told them what that character means, why it is relevant to you. And today, because we are moving into an explanatory and analytical tradition, you will not have people attracted unless you are able to present to them aesthetically. They will first like or dislike you and then decide whether they need to listen to you or not. This is a fundamental challenge. We need to think about beauty. We need to have a Saundarya Bodh in education. And that is where performing arts, that is the pedagogy that we spoke about this morning, all of those are critical. Once we are able to do that, then you will have departments, you will have faculty, you will have students, whatever. Numbers are notional, like I said. But we need to have this vision that within the next 5-10 years, we are going to compound and multiply. Gantiji will probably present later today, or he's already spoken about this. We are moving from 12 centers to 23 to 100 centers. I know the 3-year grand plan that he has, and I'm absolutely convinced that he will execute this. And if we can combine, we can partner, we can power that vision, then you will see IKS becoming a mainstream episteme. And in 10 years, you can say IKS, we don't need to explain. We don't need to go back to the vocabulary because that becomes de facto. That is the transformation that we are looking to see. And in about 15 years, if we are able to establish and make a case for IKS as the fundamental episteme, then the global narrative about the grand challenges, whether it is loneliness, whether it is sustainability, it is immigration, it is xenophobia, all of those can be tackled using the diverse universal episteme that we call Indian knowledge systems. Thank you.